In 1919, in New Orleans. A killer who has already struck multiple times. Who has never been caught. And who is now telling you exactly when he plans to strike again. He wrote a letter addressed to the entire city. And at the bottom, it is signed simply, The Axeman. What followed is one of the strangest, most unsettling chapters in American criminal history. A case that was never officially solved. A killer who seemed to vanish as suddenly as he appeared. And a city that responded to terror in a way no one could have predicted. New Orleans in the late 1910s was a city alive with contradiction. It was a place of music, culture, and vibrant community life. But it was also a city still navigating the raw tensions of post-Civil War America. Poverty. Immigration. A police force that was underfunded and overextended. Between 1918 and 1919, a series of violent home invasions struck the city with terrifying consistency. Victims were attacked in the night, inside their own homes, while they slept. Doors were broken in. Windows were forced open. And in case after case, the same strange detail appeared at the scene. A chisel. A panel chiseled out of the back door. And an axe, often the victim's own, left behind. The attacker was never seen clearly. Never identified. And to this day, has never been definitively named. To understand this case, you have to understand who the victims were. Most of them were Italian-American grocers. Immigrants who had come to New Orleans seeking a better life. They ran small corner grocery stores, often with their homes attached to or directly above the business. These were hard-working families. Husband and wife. Sometimes children in the next room. The first widely documented attack of this particular series took place on the night of May 22, 1918. Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were discovered by Joseph's two brothers, Jake and Andrew, who were asleep in the adjoining apartment. Just before dawn, they were jolted awake by a series of muffled groans and frantic thuds coming through the wall. When they rushed next door, they found a scene of total confusion. Investigators found evidence of forced entry through a chiseled back door panel. An axe had been taken from the property and left at the scene. The couple did not survive. But the police did not look far for their first suspect. They arrested Andrew Maggio, believing the sounds of the struggle were too loud for him to have missed. It was only after further investigation that they realized the brothers were not the killers. They were the first witnesses to a phantom. Investigators noted something peculiar from the very beginning. There was no evidence of robbery. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. Whatever the motive was, it did not appear to be financial gain. And that made it far more difficult to understand. The attacks continued through the summer of 1918. In late June, just over a month after the Maggio attack, a baker named Louis Bessumer and a woman named Harriet Lowe were found injured at his store on Dorgenois Street. Again, a chiseled door panel. Again, an axe left at the scene. Harriet Lowe would later die from her injuries. Louis Bessumer survived but faced a separate ordeal, accusations and suspicion from the community that would complicate the investigation. Then in August 1918, a pregnant woman named Mrs. Edward Schneider was found alone in her bedroom, having survived an attack. She later recovered and delivered her child safely. But she could provide investigators with almost no description of her attacker. Days later, a man named Joseph Romano was attacked in his home. His two nieces, who lived with him, heard sounds in the night and found him collapsed. He survived briefly but did not recover. The city was now paying attention. And the police had almost nothing to work with. Police in New Orleans at this time were not equipped for a case of this nature. Fingerprinting was still a relatively new tool in American policing, and its use was inconsistent. What investigators did have were witness accounts, and those accounts were frustratingly vague. What struck investigators was the pattern. Not just in method, but in victim selection. Almost all of the victims were Italian-American grocers. This detail led some investigators and community members to speculate about organized crime. Specifically, the Mafia, which did have a documented presence in New Orleans at the time. The theory was that these attacks were targeted. Intimidation. Extortion. Punishment for those who refused to pay or cooperate. But no direct evidence linked any organized crime figure to the attacks. And the theory could not explain all of the victims, some of whom had no known connection to any criminal network. Then the attacks paused. For several months, the city held its breath. Some believed the attacker had moved on. Or been scared off. Or perhaps had been arrested for something else entirely and was sitting in a cell somewhere, unidentified. But in the spring of 1919, the attacks resumed. And this time, they came with something no one expected. On March 13, 1919, a letter was delivered to the Times-Picayune newspaper in New Orleans. It was published the following day. The letter claimed to be written by the Axeman himself. It was bizarre. Theatrical. Almost mocking in its tone. The writer described himself as a being from another world, a demon, beyond human understanding. He claimed he was not fully of this earth and could not be caught. But then, buried inside this strange, almost philosophical language, came a specific threat. The writer stated that on the coming Tuesday night, at the stroke of midnight, he would pass through the city again. And he would spare any home from which he could hear jazz music being played. The writer warned that at midnight on Tuesday, March 18, moving into the early hours of March 19, he would pass through the city. March 19 was the feast of Saint Joseph, a date of deep significance within the Italian-American Catholic community of New Orleans. He signed the letter, The Axeman. What happened next is one of the most remarkable documented responses to terror in American history. That Tuesday night, New Orleans played jazz. Clubs were packed. Bands performed through midnight. Families hosted impromptu gatherings with live music in their homes. A local musician even composed a piece called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me Papa, by Joseph John de Villa, which became a dance hall hit. Whether in defiance, in genuine fear, or in dark humor, the city played. And that night, there were no reported attacks. Over the months of investigation, a number of people were arrested and questioned. Some were accused publicly. None were ever convicted in connection with the Axeman attacks. Louis Bessumer, the baker who had himself survived an attack, was arrested after Harriet Lowe made statements before her death that investigators found suspicious. He was tried. He was acquitted. Joseph Mumfre, a man with a documented criminal history in New Orleans, became one of the most discussed figures in the case. But his connection to the Axeman story came primarily from events that happened after the attacks appeared to stop. In December 1920, a widow named Esther Pepitone, whose husband, Mike, had been the Axeman's final victim in October 1919, shot and killed a man named Joseph Mumfre on a street in Los Angeles. She claimed he was the Axeman. She claimed he had been watching her. That she recognized him. That she had followed him across the country to find him. Esther Pepitone was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, public sentiment, and the strange nature of her story, may have played a role in what happened next. She served just 3.5 years before being released, after which she stepped back into the shadows of history. Whether she was telling the truth, whether Joseph Mumfre was actually the Axeman, has never been conclusively proven or disproven. Historical records show that Mumfre had been imprisoned during periods when the attacks paused, which some researchers find compelling. But the evidence is circumstantial. No physical evidence ever definitively connected him to any crime scene. The mafia theory remained persistent throughout the years following the case. Because many victims were Italian grocers, some investigators believed that the Black Hand, an early form of the Italian mob, was responsible for extortion-related hits. However, the lack of stolen money and the chaotic nature of the attacks didn't fit the professional profile of organized crime. The attacks associated with the Axeman appear to have ended in late 1919. The final documented attack connected to the case was on October 27, 1919. Mike Pepitone died following an attack, and it was his widow who would later travel to Los Angeles and shoot Joseph Mumfre. After that night, the city waited. And the Axeman did not return. No one was ever officially charged with the Axeman murders. The case was never formally closed in the sense of a conviction. It simply stopped. And over time, moved from active investigation to historical mystery. The victims and their families were largely left without justice. Without answers. The Italian-American community of New Orleans, which had lived under particular fear during these months, gradually rebuilt a sense of safety, though the memory remained for generations. The case became a subject of historical fascination. Books were written. Documentaries were made. Researchers continued to examine the surviving records. And still, no definitive answer. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of the most genuinely unresolved criminal cases in American history. Not simply because evidence disappeared. Not because no one looked hard enough. What we are left with are the victims. Real people. Real families who experienced something terrifying and never received an answer. And we are left with an unanswered question that has stood for over 100 years. Who was the Axeman? If you found this deep dive meaningful, please give the video a like and subscribe with the bell on. It really helps keep these stories alive and bring more cases like this to light. And don't go just yet, I've placed one other case on the screen that I think you'll find just as haunting. I'll see you over there.